Emma Lubitch, and you're watching CAN TV. We're here today with Andy Thayer, longtime activist and co-founder of both the Gay Liberation Network and the Chicago Coalition Against War and Racism. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Emma. It's a pleasure.
So it's been a pretty monumental month for Chicago and for the country. As somebody who's long been involved in grassroots organizing, what feels different about the moment that we're in, or what feels the same?
Well, this is definitely different from most usual times, if you will, in a totally good way. The closest analogy that I can come to is the feeling in the months leading up to the second U.S. invasion of Iraq. That was way back in 2003. I know ancient history for a lot of folks, but what really struck me about what was going on then is that regular folks who had never been involved in any kind of activist work of any kind decided they were so pissed off about this oncoming war that they organized their own stuff. They didn't wait for established organization to do it. And it's a good thing that they didn't, because they just took the initiative. And so we saw a blossoming all around, not just this city, but right around the country and the world, all sorts of neighborhood anti-war groups. People just were so pissed off at what the politicians of both parties were doing that they decided they had to take matters into their own hands. And so you had events. Every day there were multiple events in multiple neighborhoods in the city. No one could keep up with it all. And that was a good thing. It made for the largest, up to that point, the largest single day of demonstrations in world history. The New York Times at the time said, there's two forces in the world. There's those who want to invade, and then there's world public opinion, as expressed directly, not through some stupid, Facebook or Twitter, liking this or anything, but people getting out into the streets themselves. And I think that's what's made this movement so powerful. It's worst things that were previously of the mainstream discussion, things like defund the police, have now become a mainstream issue, and people, not just politicals like myself, but everyday people in all walks of life are saying, why are we spending all this money on police? If we spent this money on our communities, especially our Black and brown communities, then we would have a much better, a much saner society. I have written in years past about the insane level of funding that our Chicago police get. 40% of the city's operating budget, for example. A single cop costs $140,000 to start in just salary and benefits. We just lost by one vote the notion of $33 million from the CPS wasting money on police in our schools, rather than giving every school a nurse, every school a counselor, every school the special needs support that it needs. So that all this is on the agenda is directly due to people getting out of the streets and forcing it. But we're not done by any stretch of the imagination. The contrast between what we've seen in this city in terms of actual concrete gains over the past 3 weeks, in terms of what is actually being implemented, such as CPD out of CPS and other important things like that, such as walk away from the police contract. We haven't gotten those in this city yet. And so we really need to put Mayor Lightfoot's feet to the fire on this stuff, that we will not accept no for an answer. And everything that I'm hearing from young Black organizers is they're not fooled by any of this, any of her promises, her 90-day this, or we'll study it that. So it's got a total grassroots feeling about it, coming from the bottom up, which is something you rarely see in the history of any nation. We saw it in the late 60s, early 70s in this country. We saw it during the early civil rights movement in the late 50s, early 60s. We saw it in the great labor movements of the 1930s. So this is a rare time in people's history, and we need to leverage it to get concrete gains right now. Don't let the moment pass.
Yeah. So June is Pride Month, which is typically filled with more kind of like corporate party forward celebrations. And Pride this year looked a lot different. And partially I think that's because of the lockdown and COVID, but I think it's also because of the protests. So can you talk a little bit about the intersection now between the LGBTQ movement and the movement for Black Lives in Chicago?
Well, for anyone who's been to a lot of the protests organized by young Black organizers, and I'm not just talking about the last 3 weeks, but ever since Ferguson, so many young Black organizers also self-identify as queer. And if they're not self-identifying as such, they are absolutely in favor of full LGBTQ liberation in a way that the elder generation of Black civil rights leaders often hesitated, or worse, were on the wrong side. So there is a clear generational break here we've seen ever since Ferguson. I mean, it is really, to come out with homophobic or transphobic stuff within the Black Lives Matter movement now, casts you on the other side. And the organizers from a host of groups that have been leading this have been really clear about this, and I think it's quite admirable. There was a post on a webpage a while ago when Trump signed his horrible anti-trans order, and someone said, "Oh, why is it no one's ever there for us when something like this goes on?" Implying that people in quote unquote other movements weren't on our side. And it was, I had to write back. It's like, have you ever been to a Black Lives Matter protest? Because the organizers are very, very clear. This is intersectional, and not just, in favor of trans and LGBTQ people in general, but also in favor of women, in favor of Palestine, which is again a huge dividing line between the movement of the past 5 or so years versus the older movement. So, and this is really getting real. People on the outside may think, and that don't know their history about Stonewall, may be thinking, well, all you LGBT folks, you're just sort of tacking on Black Lives Matter as an extra. That's not at all the case if you look at what Stonewall was about. Not only was Stonewall a multiracial rebellion itself, but I think even more importantly, and I think this is what a lot of LGBTQ activists miss, what made Stonewall important was that people organized after the rebellion. There have been any number of other rebellions by LGBT people at that time, and I've written about this, and maybe you can throw a link or whatever about it. But the critical thing about Stonewall is not that people fought back. The critical thing about Stonewall that made it unique from the at least 3 other LGBTQ rebellions of that era was that people began organizing after it. And some of the organizing they did is something that, in many respects, young LGBTQ activists in the Black Lives Matter movement today would recognize and embrace, which is that the early groups, they were called the Gay Liberation Front. There were chapters all over the place. And they embraced anti-racism and organized around it. They organized a series of protests and solidarity actions for the Black Panthers when the Black Panther Party, which was the premier anti-racist organization in the States at the time, was facing horrendous violence at the hands of the police. And the Gay Liberation Front, even though BPP at the time was not a pro-gay or whatever, no major organization was, they did this. And as a result, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, in a famous speech by Huey P. Newton, their leader, came out soundly in favor of gay liberation. It was a well-publicized, it wasn't just an afterthought. This was carefully thought through. They became the first major so-called non-gay organization to embrace gay liberation. It was a tremendous breakthrough for the gay liberation movement, which had previously been confronting a lot of nasty homophobic I won't swear here. A lot of nasty homophobic sentiment within a heavily Stalinized movement at the time. The new left in the United States was notoriously macho. The new left at the time was very anti-gay. It considered being that homosexuality was a so-called petty bourgeois deviation and all sorts of other homophobic stuff. And so tremendous gain, but it didn't stop there. I mean, the movement, the Gay Liberation Front, was an important part of the anti-U.S. war on Vietnam movement. That, in spite of facing, oftentimes some, bigoted stuff from within the movement, they were proud members of the anti-war movement. They're proud members of fighting against police brutality. And in this day and age, when we're talking about let's fund Black and brown communities and not the repressive forces of the state, they were not only for, against the police, they were also against the U.S. war on Vietnam that was, as Dr. King had said, robbing Black communities in particular of resources they desperately needed. So it was truly intersectional before the name even was, that term was invented. Also, I should add that a lot of the early Gay Liberation Front members played a pivotal role in radicalizing the women's movement of the time, which was also very anti-lesbian, homophobic, and I think that radicalization played a key role in boosting the women's movement to the point that we won the Roe v. Wade abortion rights decision in 1973, something which is under severe threat, literally as we speak right now, with a pending Supreme Court decision, which could happen any day now, perhaps upholding a horrible Louisiana law that would severely curtail people's access to abortion, particularly Black and brown women and poor women in general.
Well, I'm happy you brought up Stonewall, because that's what I was going to ask you, because I think that the way Stonewall is remembered is often kind of sanitized or glossed over, and it's been kind of co-opted. So, I mean, but thinking of the radical aspects of Stonewall, do you see threads coming through to the movement right now?
Yes, and I think it's up to those of us who've been around long enough, I've got the gray hairs for it, to actually try and dig up this history for people to learn that that Stonewall was intersectional before the term intersectionality was invented. That the whole notion of that we've seen literally for the past 4 decades in, whether you call it the LGBT movement or the gay movement or whatever, has been a very narrow single issue focus, where we're only concerned, quote unquote, with gay rights only or LGBT rights only. And that not only ignores the fact that the overwhelming majority of LGBT people have multiple identities, whether it's women also, or people of color, and or this notion that we can only be in favor of our rights alone is such a barrier to the kind of solidarity that we need to take on the rich and powerful who control this country, which is the biggest and most powerful empire in world history. If we're only concerned with ourselves, then frankly we're going to lose. And so solidarity isn't just a nice concept; it's a way to win. And I've felt great frustration. I can remember during the run-up to the first U.S. invasion of Iraq, a group of us appealing to, actually it was the second invasion, I should say, appealing to what was then known as the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force to oppose this war, because that war, which we have seen now has drained trillions out of all of our communities, it not only hurts LGBT people and others in the Middle East tremendously, it also deprives our communities of the funding that we need. I mean, it's no accident in this country that we've got fifth-rate social services, whether in public housing, public transportation, healthcare provision, education. All these things cost money in a way that people, for example, in Europe or Canada, they look at the United States and say, boy, you guys are backward. And we are. It's because we are attempting to maintain the largest informal empire in world history. And that costs big bucks. Half of the federal discretionary budget goes to the military. 40% of our city's operational budget goes to the police. This robs our communities of the resources. And I think that Stonewall activists of the time would be recognizing many of the same problems we're fighting today.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I think that what you're saying about the lack of social services and healthcare that's appropriately, it's such a perfect storm, I think, with the movement right now in the midst of COVID-19, because I think that it has just put such an amplifier on all of those problems, especially in poor and Black and brown communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you know, hats off to the frontline workers in the hospitals and the nursing homes, who are, of course, disproportionately Black and brown people, who are not just sitting back and saying, well, thank you for the jets flying overhead to honor us, quote unquote, but we want a livable wage. We want staffing. I mean, I've listened to National Nurses Union for years, and they said, you know, we can't get these damned hospitals in this state to give guaranteed staffing levels so we can do the things that we went into this profession to do, which is to care for people. You talk to the Chicago Teachers Union members. This brilliant strike they had last year was about getting our mayor to live up to all the things she promised as a candidate. And she has steadfastly, where is our elected school board? Okay, why did we have a 4-3 decision against us yesterday about CPD out of CPS? You know, if those 7 people had been an elected school board the way that Lori promised as a candidate, and then frankly shit-canned once it came down to it as mayor, it would have been a different story yesterday. And I think that one of the things I am just most excited about and most proud about is that so many of our young Black and brown organizers, they see through this. They're no dummies. They see what our mayor has promised and what she has delivered, and said, these are 2 different things. And in that independence of our movement from the established powers, that was one of the critical things about Stonewall itself. Stonewall came at a particular time when people were ready for a very different kind of politics. There had been 3 LGBT rebellions in the years before the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion, and starting with the Compton cafeteria riot in California, and people didn't begin organizing on a mass scale after those previous ones, but the events leading up to June 1969 forged a very different kind of politics. And in some respects, and I think you can see some of that today, that the 1968 Democratic Convention here in Chicago really knocked people's heads off of the notion, literally, that the Democratic Party was their friend, that the Democratic Party would listen to the overwhelming majority of primary voters who said they wanted an anti-war candidate, and yet they got Humphrey shoved down their throats. And then literally, of course, the beating on the heads in the streets of our city here. That combined with the fact that Nixon, who was the Republican candidate, was clearly not in favor of anything that the movement was in favor of. That led to really a birth of independent politics for the next few years that made so many gains possible. The Black Panther Party, which was just really beginning to take off, didn't even have a chapter in the city of Chicago in August 1968. And yet, by December 1969, the Black Panther Party was so powerful in the city of Chicago that the CPD, the state's attorney's office, felt that they had to murder Mark Clark and Fred Hampton, so as to try and quell the exponential growth that the Black Panther Party was having. And this is because when people give up on both major parties, they have no choice but to make the change themselves. And that's what you saw beginning with the, in 1968, 1969, with the murder of MLK. Then the following year, the murder of the Black Panthers. People saw, if we're going to stop this horrible war, if we're going to get the kind of funding for our communities, we're going to have to do things like what the Black Panther Party did in terms of the survival programs. You look today and you look at the host of young Black organizers doing things like providing services within their communities because the city and the federal government won't. It's some of the same thing. People are not looking to be saved by Biden in November. I mean, I have yet to find any young Black organizer who's saying, "Oh yeah, Biden's our man. He's gonna, do all the things that we're demanding in the streets." I mean, he's come out explicitly against defunding the police. I mean, and even if he was saying all the right things, his track record of building the prison industrial complex, supporting every single war that this country has ever launched in his long career. Don't get me wrong. I loathe Trump. He's a racist and is absolutely against everything that our new movements are talking about. But when the so-called alternative is just more of the same, I think people have to say, hold it a second. How do we get Trump in the first place? Was it maybe 8 years of neoliberalism, of giving, words in favor of working people, words in favor of anti-racism, and yet the only say thing against police brutality that you get is body cams? We don't need cameras to know that people are being killed by police.
I wanted to ask you about kind of like a co-optation of the movement in a certain way, because we've seen kind of these massive corporations like Amazon, like Nike, some super problematic companies come out with statements in support of Black lives. So what does that do to the movement? Like, you're implying here, it's a total co-optation. That's what the attempt is. And if they're not able to co-opt it, they'll destroy it. That was really the history of the Occupy movement. There were numerous attempts by the Democratic Party and their corporate backers to destroy that movement. And they fortunately did not succeed in that. But when they were not able to do that, then literally the Obama Justice Department, in direct coordination with police departments around the country, worked to repress that, first starting out gingerly, but really doing everything they could to destroy the movement. One of the things that we saw, I think, with the post-Ferguson Black Lives Matter era of the movement is that there were a lot of attempts to do the same. And I think they were largely unsuccessful at the time. But I think one thing that white activists have to realize, that when you just have police killing after police killing after police killing after police killing, it's deeply traumatizing, not just for the families, but the activists who go and meet with the families, who one more time, it's all caught on tape, and yet there's going to be another time.
and we saw that in the current wave of actions after George Floyd. We have Atlanta. We have it doesn't end. And then of course the police response to the protests and so forth. Some 80% of arrests by police were in relation to quote unquote protest-related activities, not looting. And that there was a report that just came out. I'm trying to remember who came out with it, but it's a very reputable source analyzing the arrests here in our city, and 80% of them were not for looting. They were for people, particularly young Black and brown people, who were protesting police violence. And what do they get in response? More police violence. So, there are clearly attempts to co-opt the current movement. The movement is so powerful, but people have to remember every community is tremendously diverse in its political opinions. And so like in the gay movement, we got our J. Edgar Hoovers, we got our Roy Cohns, we got all sorts of assholes, frankly, who will do all, sell their souls. Hey, we got our Clarence Thomases. Every community's got them. Women against women's rights. I mean, this is the state of Phyllis Schlafly for the historians in your audience. There's all sorts of people who trade on their identity. And our mayor's been doing this herself. As a Black lesbian, blah, 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 blah. Well, I heard the most fantastic speech by Ariel Atkins at a defund Cook County jail protest this past week, where Ariel said, I'm a Black lesbian woman, and she doesn't represent me. Not by funding these cops, not by refusing to defund the police, not by supporting Academy for $95 million that could be going into our community. So there are clearly attempts to co-opt movement. I'm seeing a lot of very bright organizers saying, wait a minute, we're going to judge you by what you do and not what you say, which I think is the first step. And I'd say anyone looking at any of these jokers running for office in November, ignore the rhetoric, please. Look at what they have voted for. Look at who they're backed by. I mean, if you're hanging out with NASDAQ, as I saw a Pride event that got promoted, who's next? The FOP? The corporate takeover, they recognize the power that young Black people have been able to mobilize over the past few weeks. And they recognize that the power of those young Black people comes at their expense. And so they're definitely trying to co-opt it. And I think that most people are going to resist it, but there are going to be, as in every community, there's going to be some opportunists who see it as a way to get a new career. And clearly we've seen that in past years. I mean, Colin Powell, people don't know how Colin Powell got his start. He was the person who suppressed information about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, which was a sure ticket to rocket up the military hierarchy, the point of becoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, in the White House. I mean, this is how people will trade on their identity so as to screw their own people. And every community's got them. LGBTs have got them. Black people have got them. Brown people have got them. And this is really the problem with identity politics, is you got to judge people by what they do. And intersectionality shouldn't be just about, different racial or gender or sexuality identities. It's also got to be about class, because time and time again, you'll find that, I mean, I can remember President Obama bragging about having, a cabinet that looks like America when he first got into office in 2008. As some of us noted, they were all millionaires. Didn't exactly look like America.
What does the future of the movement look like in Chicago then? Because I think that leadership in Chicago has been so resistant to a lot of the pressure to change, where we've seen a lot of sweeping reforms across the country.
That's right.
And
that's right.
the leadership in Chicago seems to be the most resistant, considering we are a progressive city center.
Oh, we're not. There's marketing and there's reality. As I did a study based upon the FBI uniform crime statistics from 2017 and 2018, and what you found is that there are 650 cities in the United States with a population over 50,000 people. Of those 650 cities, Chicago had the third highest police per civilian ratio of any city in the United States. So there's progressive gloss, and then there's progressive reality. We're still a city that has got a ban on rent control. We're a city that has privatized to a great deal our public housing, and really chopped down our public housing stock as a result. This has direct effects on people's lives. I mean, people are much more rent burdened today than they were just a decade ago, and the destruction of public housing presided over by all of our mayors for the past 2 decades has meant that the violence rates in our city are directly affected. The fact that people see no choice but to the gangs in order to make an income and keep a roof over their heads often. All the things that our city leaders talk about caring about, they're not putting their money where their mouth is, whether you're talking about the police or you're talking about other social services. I mean, where are the mental health clinics that candidate Lightfoot promised to reopen? Where is the, it took a teacher's strike to force her to at least make a contractual commitment to have a nurse and a counselor in every school, and decent, pupil to teacher ratios. So where the future of leadership is, as an older white guy, I don't feel very qualified to say, but if history is any judge, the leadership of our movements always comes from the most unexpected places. It's the small things that tick people off, and they decide organizing with their friends, and they build a movement to counter the leadership of Mayor Lightfoot. I mean, when we're talking leadership here, let's be clear who runs the show here. If there's a problem in the city of Chicago, you got to put it right at the doorstep of the 5th floor and Mayor Lightfoot. Let's be clear about that. Secondarily, Governor Pritzker and Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. Clearly, Lori Lightfoot, if you know anything about her history, I can remember battling against her back in the 90s when she was head of what was known as the Office of Professional Standards, affectionately known as OOPS, which never seemed to find police brutality in our city. Never seemed to be able to discipline a cop. I mean, these politicians, they have a history. And you look at what she did when she was head of OPS, when you look at what she did when she was head of the police board. That's why so many of the young Black Lives Matters activists who were active from Ferguson on, they said, who are you telling me that Lightfoot's an outsider? Who are you telling me that she is genuinely committed to opposing police violence and disciplining these cops? Her whole history spoke against it. I mean, you don't get appointed to politically sensitive positions, quote unquote, overseeing the police like Lightfoot did by first Richie Daley and then Rahm, without playing ball with the establishment that is enforcing this police violence in our communities. So I think that everything I've heard from our young Black leaders of this movement today, that they're not fooled by Lightfoot. They know that we've only gotten nice rhetoric about what supposedly will happen in 90 days. And then they look at the fact that the city, even before COVID-19 hit, was not fulfilling its commitments, under the consent decree the Justice Department, that they are failing 7 ways to Sunday before the pandemic hit. And of course, they're going to use the pandemic to excuse the fact that they're still not doing this at the same time as their cops are beating heads in the street of Chicago. So I am more optimistic about the future, not just of our city, but also our movements generally in this country than I have been since I got involved in political activity in the mid-1970s. That's a long damn time. And for much of that time, I've been frankly pessimistic because I see movements getting co-opted. I see people getting co-opted by these corporations. And I haven't seen the mass activity of folks who had never been, political junkies like myself. But we're seeing something very, very different right now. We're seeing every community, I mean, out to the whitest of suburbs, we're seeing people marching and saying, no, let's not legitimize racism again, to borrow our president's phrase. And the protests that I've had the honor of live streaming, many of them, the elan that was shown, showed that this was not just about one police murder in the Twin Cities. It wasn't just about the whole series of police murders we have seen, it seems like, every week. It was also about people saying enough to a president who has made racism acceptable in far larger quarters than it used to be. That when I saw people defying the police to march on Trump Tower, something that the city of Chicago police had very successfully prevented ever since the inauguration back in 2016, and so forth, the election, I should say, in 2016, that people were attacking cop cars in front of Trump Tower. That was the #1 target of protest activity on that first big Saturday night of protests on Saturday, May 30th, because it was about much more than just George Floyd's murder, as awful that was. People had reached a limit. They'd seen the racism against not just Black people, but also against brown people. And this next election, we're already seeing it, versus Asian Americans and Chinese. People reached a limit, and we may have a President Biden, but that's not going to change things. What's going to change things, as we've seen over the past few weeks, is what people are doing in the streets. This is how Stonewall changed things. Stonewall was about LGBT people fighting for our own liberation. People said, we're not going to get it. The previous gay rights movement before that was very much a hat-in-hand movement. Let's convince experts to deign to notice us and perhaps tolerate us, whether they're politicians or medical experts. The gay liberation movement was about gay is good, mimicking in some respects Black is beautiful. And people did it for themselves. That's self-liberation. That's how it's always been. It's not going to come from any politician, no matter what their rhetoric. You have to do it yourself. And this is what has made me so much more optimistic. It was just 6 months ago, because I see people doing it for themselves. And that is the key to how all the big social gains have been won in this country, whether the late 60s, early 70s, whether you're talking the early civil rights movement, whether you're talking about the tremendous movements of the 1930s that gave us things like Social Security, that gave us things like the 40-hour work week, that gave us things like benefits for unemployment, benefits for workplace safety, and so forth, built the union movement that gave working people, really pushed back against the wealthy. During the Great Depression, the tremendous chasm between rich and poor that had developed in the 1920s before that became dramatically lessened. And in an era when young people today can no way see that they're going to have the standard of living that their parents before them, let alone perhaps collect Social Security in whatever miserable state it is when they finally are old enough to collect it. It's important to see that in the midst of the Great Depression, for example, people were able to claw back the fabulous wealth of the time from their version of Jeff Bezos and the Gates people, etc. That we can win huge gains right now. And things like the great teachers strike of last year, things like the people in the streets today, that shows the way. I mean, I would not be able to be out as an LGBT person unless people following the Stonewall rebellion said, we're going to get out in the streets and we're going to do it for ourselves. I mean, it had a profound effect on the LGBTs of the era to discard the negative self-images that they had of themselves, that people inculcate the worst garbage that we grew up in. We grew up hating ourselves, whether it's women, whether it's LGBTs, whether it's people of color. And that, while we didn't win legislative gains immediately out of Stonewall, the fact that it created an open public community birthed a worldwide movement so that you have LGBTs fighting for themselves in every single country of the world, bar none. That was birthed out of people deciding to make their own history rather than leaving it to the politicians and the corporations. So I'm very, optimistic on this 51st anniversary of Stonewall. I expect that there will be a lot of bumps in the road, massive attempts at co-optation by NGOs, which I think are a huge barrier to our progress, and certainly the corporations who are behind every single damned NGO that's got a paid staff. These are going to be tremendous barriers to our advancement, but the fact that people have realized that they can make gains through their own efforts, that's a new lesson that people are learning in the streets of Chicago, around the country right now. And it is changing the activists who are leading and participating in these protests right now are very different people than they were 3 months ago. 3 months ago is another person's been murdered and nothing's going to happen. And people are seeing today something very different, that we can make the change. And that's really what makes me so optimistic. I'm very proud of the youth